I'm Marion Cole, 72 years old, and for nearly 4 decades, I poured my life into the wide stretch of land my husband Ethan and I built together. 7 months after laying him to rest, I thought I understood loneliness, but I hadn't yet seen its sharpest edge. My children Ryan and Lauren hadn't been around much since the funeral. So when a message came saying they were coming to help, I clung to a quiet hope it might mean something good. I didn't know then that their visit would end with bruises on my ribs, papers on my kitchen table, and the fight of my life to keep what was mine. That day began like so many others on the ranch, with the wind carrying a chill through the back door and the smell of coffee warming on the stove, but it would end differently. By the time the sun went down, I would realize they weren't coming home to help. They were coming to take. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to take what was yours. I was born and raised in a small Nevada town where you knew the names of every family at church, and the post office clerk had your mail ready before you asked. My parents didn't have much, but they taught me that what you work for matters more than what you're handed. Ethan and I met at a county fair when I was 22, married the next spring, and bought the ranch piece by piece until it became 1,200 acres of pasture canyons and a life we built with our own hands. We raised Ryan and Lauren to be part of it, bottle-feeding calves before school, mending fence lines on Saturdays, bringing in hay before the weather turned. It was hard work, but it was ours. Ethan believed a home wasn't just a house, it was the land beneath it and the history tied to it. When we finally paid off the last acre, we framed the deed and hung it in the living room, not as decoration, but as a promise to keep it whole. Even after Ethan's health began to fail, he would sit on the porch and point out how the light fell across the east pasture, or how the canyon cut a shadow at dusk, reminding me why it was worth the work. After he passed, I kept everything as it had been: his hat on the porch rail, his chair by the fire, maybe to feel like I wasn't alone in it. The winter after the funeral was quiet in the way only an empty house can be. Ryan didn't visit at all, and Lauren called twice, both times asking about the ranch. When her last message came saying they were coming to talk about how to keep the ranch going and help me out, I tried to believe it might be true. I spent the day before their arrival dusting the framed photographs in the hallway, pausing on the one of Ryan holding his first calf and Lauren brushing her favorite mare. I prepared the guest rooms, made the roast Ethan always served on hard days, and tried to shake the feeling that the word help sat heavy in my mouth. I couldn't see the whole shape of it yet, but something in me knew the quiet in that house wasn't just grief anymore. It was waiting for the storm to start. Ryan and Lauren pulled into the drive just after 3 o'clock, the hum of the tires over gravel louder than it should have been in the still afternoon. The black SUV stopped short of the porch, and when they stepped out, there was no warmth in their faces. Ryan was taller than I remembered, shoulders squared, scanning the porch and windows as though assessing them. Lauren carried a leather briefcase, not the canvas tote she used to sling over her shoulder on visits. Neither smiled, and I didn't either. They walked in as guests would not as children coming home. We settled in the kitchen without any small talk. Ryan stayed on his feet for a moment, patting the table once as if testing its steadiness before lowering himself into a chair. Lauren placed her briefcase down, undid the latches, and began laying out papers. No mention of their father, no questions about the ranch, just maps, folders, deeds, and typed reports spread across the table like it was a boardroom. I stayed near the stove, my hands gripping the sink until my knuckles whitened. Lauren slid a paper toward me with the casualness of someone passing a grocery list. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Preliminary transfer of property rights." Ryan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He spoke first, saying the taxes were climbing and the upkeep of the land was more than I could handle. The fences needed replacing, the barn roof leaked, and I was, in his words, too old to manage it alone. He suggested selling a few hundred acres, the east pasture, maybe part of the ridge, to ease the burden. Lauren nodded in agreement, her voice measured, almost gentle, as she said, "I would still be able to live here." Nothing would change, she insisted. All that was needed was my signature. I looked down at my hands, the skin thinned over the years, veins and knuckles more pronounced than I liked to admit. Those hands had driven fence posts, pulled calves in snowstorms, and poured boiling water over frozen locks. This place had never given us anything easily, but it had taught us how to hold on. I asked who the buyer was. Ryan said a development group from Reno, a green energy project, wind farms, maybe solar panels. He claimed they'd preserve the landscape and bring jobs to the area. He made it sound like a gift. Lauren slid another document toward me, dense with legal language. Ryan said he'd already spoken to someone at the bank, that the process would be simple if I just agreed. I told them I needed time to think. Ryan's jaw tightened for a moment before he masked it with a faint nod. Lauren began gathering the papers, and Ryan suggested they check on the horses while I considered it. After they left the room, the house felt heavier. The roast I'd made for them sat untouched, its aroma mixing with something less comforting, a stillness that settled in my chest. I went to the living room and lowered myself into Ethan's old chair. My eyes went to the mantel, to the framed deed we'd hung the day we finished paying off the last acre. It wasn't ornate, just a yellowing page in a wooden frame, but it was a marker of our years of labor. I stayed there as the sun fell behind the barn, painting the pasture gold. By the time Ryan and Lauren returned, I knew they hadn't come to help. They'd come to take. The evening passed without mention of the papers. Ryan busied himself in the barn. Lauren stayed in the guest room with her phone. In the morning, the knock at the back door came early before sunrise. I was feeding the dogs, the coffee barely started. Ryan stood there in jeans and laced boots, saying he needed help in the tack room with a broken latch on one of the saddle trunks. His voice was even almost too calm. I dried my hands on my apron and followed him. The tack room smelled of leather dust and liniment. I flipped the light, the bulb humming faintly as it warmed. Ryan stepped aside, holding the door as I walked in first. Lauren came in behind me and closed it. What happened next was quiet, almost clinical. Ryan gripped my arm and forced me down onto the bench where we used to tie saddle straps. Lauren held my other shoulder in place. The first strike of the belt caught my side. I turned too slowly. There were 3, maybe 4 blows, enough to bruise but not break. The pain was sharp, but it was the coldness in their movements that stayed with me. When they stopped, I stayed seated. Lauren pulled a folded paper from her coat, the same documents from the day before. She set the folder beside me and said I could sign or think about it, but next time might not be so easy. Then they walked out, leaving the door open behind them. I stayed there until the ache in my ribs told me to move slowly. I left the papers on the bench, tucked between the wall and the hook where we used to hang halters. Back inside, the clock on the microwave blinked 7:12. I poured myself cold coffee and drank it without caring for the taste. Ryan and Lauren were back in the guest room, pretending to sleep. Later, when they left to meet someone in town, I went to the barn, found the belt, rolled it up, wrapped it in a feed sack, and tucked it under the haystack near the mule pen. Not to hide it, to remember. The next morning, Ryan acted as though nothing had happened. Lauren lingered in her room on the phone with someone speaking in low tones. By midday, their car pulled away again, giving me a moment to breathe. I returned to the tack room for the folder. My ribs still ached, but I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were printed map sections of our land, highlighted in pink, each labeled for sale. In one margin, Lauren had written, Phase 1 March. There was a second phase marked for July, the south pasture, the barn, even the mule pen. My signature line was already printed blank, but the date above it was filled in March 15th, my birthday. That night, I didn't sleep. I moved through the rooms, switching on lamps, pausing in corners we'd filled with our history. This wasn't about helping me, and it wasn't about preserving the ranch. They had a plan, and I was just the final piece they needed to move forward. The quiet in the house no longer felt like grief. It was the stillness before something broke. The morning after I found Lauren's handwriting in the margins of those maps, the house was still before daylight. I stood at the kitchen counter, pouring kibble into the dog's bowls, when Ryan appeared in the doorway. His boots were already on laces tight, a denim jacket zipped halfway up. He said there was a problem in the tack room. A latch on one of the saddle trunks had broken, and he needed a second pair of hands. His tone was calm, maybe a little too calm for the hour. I set the scoop down, dried my hands on the edge of my apron, and followed him out across the yard. The tack room smelled of leather dust and a hint of liniment. I flipped the switch, and the bulb above hummed faintly before casting its yellow glow. Ryan stepped aside to hold the door as I walked in. The hinges creaked, and before I could turn around, Lauren slipped in behind me and closed it. What happened next didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with the quiet certainty of something planned. Ryan gripped my right arm, pressing me down onto the bench where we used to tie saddle straps. Lauren's hand clamped my left shoulder. The leather belt moved faster than my body could react. The first strike landed across my side, sharp and hot. 2 more followed, maybe a third after that. Enough to leave their mark, not enough to break bones. My ears rang, and their voices blurred into the hum of the light and the sound of leather cutting the air. When it stopped, Ryan let go, and I stayed seated. Lauren reached into her coat and pulled out the same folder they had shown me at the kitchen table. She set it beside me, the corner of it pressing into my thigh, and said I could sign or think about it, but next time would be harder. They walked out without closing the door. I stayed still, my gaze fixed on a scratch in the cabinet where Ethan once caught it with a nail. The shape reminded me of a crooked letter T, and I kept my eyes on it until my breathing slowed. Eventually, I stood and left the folder where it was. Back in the house, the clock on the microwave blinked 7:12. I poured myself cold coffee and drank it in one swallow. Ryan and Lauren were in the guest room again, their voices low behind the door. That afternoon, when they left for town, I returned to the barn. I found the belt, rolled it tightly, and slid it into a feed sack before tucking it deep into the hay behind the mule pen. It wasn't to hide it. I wanted to remember exactly where it was. The ache in my ribs grew darker in color by evening. I moved slowly, keeping to the quiet corners of the house, listening for their return. When they came back, Ryan whistled as if nothing had happened. Lauren stayed in the kitchen for a moment, then disappeared into her room. They didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. 2 days later, while they were gone, I brought the folder inside. I laid it on the kitchen table, opened it carefully, and looked through each page. The maps were printed in color sections of our land, shaded in pink. The labels showed planned sales in phases. Phase 1 was marked for March, Phase 2 for July. The July phase included the south pasture, the barn, even the mule pen. My name was printed above the signature line, the date filled in as March 15th, my birthday. I closed the folder and set it aside. The weight of it lingered in the room, even after it was gone from sight. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in Ethan's chair with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the wind tap the sycamore branches against the barn roof. It was the kind of sound that could go unnoticed on most nights, but not now. Now, every noise felt like a reminder. The following morning, Ryan poured himself coffee without looking at me. Lauren came out later, her hair damp from a shower phone pressed to her ear. She spoke in numbers and dates, her voice low and steady. When they left before noon, I walked the length of the porch and watched their car disappear past the fence line. Only then did I go back to the table, open the folder again, and read every word until the sun shifted across the floorboards. The legal terms were heavy layered, with language that could be twisted. In the margins, Lauren had scribbled short notes in blue ink names, dates, and reminders. One page had a heading that read, Conversion, April target, and another listed pending agreement once matriarch signs. That word matriarch looked cold on the page, like it was a placeholder instead of a person. By late afternoon, they were back. Ryan busied himself in the yard moving tools from one shed to another. Lauren went into the pantry rearranging jars and boxes as though the space already belonged to her. That night, she set the folder on the table again and said they needed my answer by Tuesday. She added that if I didn't sign, they could pursue another option. Her eyes didn't leave mine when she explained they had already spoken to a lawyer. They could have me evaluated, she said, and claim I was no longer able to manage the land. It would be for my own good, she added. The words sat between us like a closed door. I nodded slightly, but inside, a plan began to take shape. I didn't show it. That night, after they went upstairs, I gathered the most important documents: the deed, Ethan's old ledger, the notes he had left in the mudroom. I wrapped them in plastic, placed them in a sealed tub, and carried it to the root cellar. I tucked it behind the crates of potatoes, hidden but within reach. Then I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and listened to the wind work through the branches outside. It was steady, like it had no intention of stopping. That night, after Ryan and Lauren went upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen long enough to hear their footsteps fade. I took the flashlight from the drawer, stepped out the back door, and crossed to the root cellar. The sealed tub was right where I'd left it, wedged between the potato crates. I carried it to the dining table and laid out each piece: the deed, Ethan's ledger, the folded notes we'd written years ago about keeping the land whole. I kept my hands on the paper longer than necessary, as if the weight of it could anchor me. Then I set everything back in the tub and returned it to its place. The next morning, I called Edna Moore. She had worked at the county recorder's office for years before retiring, the same person who'd helped us with water rights a long time ago. Her voice was still the same, low and steady, even when she'd just woken up. I told her I needed to ask about private land protections. That was all. She said she'd come by with coffee that afternoon. We didn't sit in the kitchen when she arrived. I led her to the hayshed, away from the windows. She handed me a paper cup, still warm, and listened while I explained what had been happening. Edna's brow furrowed once, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said she knew someone who used to work for the Bureau of Land Management, a woman named May Campbell, who now did private consulting. She could review any documents, check for easements, and find out what protections were still in place from Ethan's original contracts. Edna told me May had handled situations like this before, even when family was involved. We walked back toward the house just as Ryan stepped out from behind the truck. He squinted at Edna, then looked at me. "Afternoon," he said flat. Edna just nodded and kept walking. I could tell from the way his eyes followed her to the car that he understood something was moving he couldn't see. That evening, Lauren brought the folder to the table again. She set it down in front of me and said she was done dragging this out. "If you don't sign by Tuesday," she said, "we'll have to go another way." I asked what that meant. She said they'd already spoken to a lawyer. They could prove I was no longer capable of managing the land, that I'd refused medical attention, that I was showing signs of confusion. "It's for your own good," she added. The kitchen was warm from the oven, but my arms felt cold. I nodded slowly as though I were still thinking it over. That night, I went through the house and gathered more than just papers. I took the family photo albums, a handful of Ethan's letters, even the cassette tape he had recorded after his first stroke. I wrapped them all in plastic and placed them in the tub in the cellar. Then I locked the back door and sat at the upstairs window, watching the sycamore sway hard against the sky. The wind had picked up, and the air felt like it was carrying something with it. Tuesday morning came with a dry wind that pushed dust across the porch. I was at the kitchen table early, setting out 1 cup instead of 3. Ryan and Lauren came down late. They didn't ask about breakfast. Around noon, Lauren set the folder in front of me, this time open to the signature line with a black pen placed beside it. "This is your last chance," she said. I closed the folder without looking at the page and slid it onto the pantry's top shelf. Ryan let out a short breath and pushed back from the table. Lauren's eyes stayed on me for a long moment before she followed him out. When their car pulled away, I went to the root cellar and brought the tub back upstairs. I laid everything out again this time, adding the contact information Edna had written for me on the side of a muffin box. I dialed the number. May answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, each word measured. I told her I wasn't ready to file anything yet, but needed someone to walk me through what protections I had. She said she could come the next afternoon. That evening, I opened the safe in Ethan's office. Inside was the cassette tape he had labeled for after. I hadn't listened to it before. I found the old player in the garage, set the tape inside, and pressed play. Ethan's voice came through softer, slower than I remembered, talking about the land, about how the value of a place came from memory and care. Then he said, if he couldn't trust our own, I should make it public. Sometimes shame is more powerful than any court order, he said. I sat there until the tape clicked off. The next morning, I made copies of every document and printed the photographs I had taken of the bruises 2 days after they hit me. I wrote a 1-page statement in my own hand, detailing everything from the moment they arrived. I placed it all in a large manila envelope and wrote on the front, "in case." Then I put it back in the drawer of Ethan's desk and went to make coffee. By the time Ryan and Lauren returned later that day, I felt different. I wasn't just avoiding a signature anymore. I was ready for whatever came next. They didn't notice the change, but I knew the ground had shifted. Wednesday morning started quietly enough. Ryan parked the truck halfway down the drive, instead of near the barn, and Lauren was already on the phone before she stepped onto the porch. Her tone was bright, the kind of voice you use when speaking to someone you want to impress. I was trimming the tomato beds near the fence, careful with my side, and didn't look up until I heard tires on the gravel. A black SUV rolled in, slowing as it neared the house. The man who stepped out wore a gray blazer and carried a leather briefcase. He shook hands with Ryan and Lauren before they led him inside. I stayed in the garden watching from the kitchen window once they disappeared. 10 minutes passed, then 15 before he came out again. His steps were slower now, his expression thoughtful as he headed back to his vehicle. An hour later, Ryan called me into the dining room. He said they had scheduled a wellness review. A third-party specialist would be visiting to make sure I was still able to make financial decisions. He called it a standard precaution. Lauren sat with her hands folded, saying it was nothing personal, just protection for everyone involved. I didn't argue. I went to my room, opened the cabinet, and took out the land survey Ethan and I had framed back in 1998. His handwriting was still in the corner, listing acreage and notes about each tract. I set it on my dresser where I could see it. That evening, I drove into town to see Reverend Paul. He had married Ethan and me, buried my parents, and had been a friend to our family for decades. I brought him a peach pie and told him I needed a witness, someone who could vouch for my soundness if it came to that. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and said he'd stop by the next day. The wellness review happened Friday morning. A woman named Dana arrived in a gray coat carrying a clipboard. She smiled as she introduced herself, then asked if I knew the date. I told her. She asked who the president was, and I answered. Then she asked if I knew where I was. I paused, looked around the kitchen, and then told her I was standing in the house I had paid for on land I had worked for 5 decades. She didn't write anything down after that. The interview ended quietly, and she shook my hand before stepping outside with Ryan and Lauren. I couldn't hear what was said, but when they returned, Lauren kept her eyes on the floor, and Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. That night, I stayed in the porch rocker with Ethan's coat around my shoulders, watching the stars settle in above the barn. The air was cool, and the stillness felt deliberate. Sunday afternoon, Lauren pulled a roast from the freezer and started cooking early. Ryan set the table without being asked, laying out cloth napkins and the good plates we only used on Christmas. The scene was too practiced, too measured, but I didn't comment. By evening, candles flickered in the center of the table. They made small talk over the meal, the weather, the horses, but it felt like they were building to something. Halfway through, Lauren reached into her cardigan and pulled out a different folder slimmer than the last. She set it beside my plate and said it was a simplified version of the agreement. Ryan added that a buyer from Nevada was ready to make an offer on the Southern Tract if we moved quickly. He said it would take pressure off me and give me a chance to rest. I kept my hands in my lap, letting their words settle in the air. After a moment, I stood and walked to the office. I locked the door, opened the desk drawer, and took out the envelope labeled "In Case." I added one more thing, a printed photograph I had taken 2 nights earlier of the original folder left unattended on the kitchen counter. The buyer's contact information was visible in the frame. Then I reached for the old flip phone in the drawer, one I hadn't used in years. The battery still had life. I scrolled to Edna's name and typed a single word. Ready. 20 minutes later, I returned to the dining room. The food was cooling, and the candles had burned halfway down. I thanked them for dinner, but said I wasn't hungry. Then I told them I had spoken to someone about placing a conservation easement on the land to protect it in its entirety. I told them any sale without my signature would be challenged, and that I had enough documentation to open an investigation into coercion and elder intimidation. My voice stayed level. Ryan's face turned red. Lauren's paled. They didn't say anything, and I didn't add more. They stood after a long silence and went upstairs without clearing the table. I stayed in the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and listened to the house settle. The next morning, Lauren didn't come downstairs, and Ryan lingered by the window with his coffee. The folder from the night before was gone, and I knew then that whatever plans they had in motion were about to shift. May arrived the next morning in a silver sedan, a thin trail of dust following her down the driveway. She stepped out with a leather satchel in one hand and a folder tucked under her arm. Ryan appeared from the side yard as if to meet her halfway, but she kept walking toward the porch. Without slowing, she introduced herself, gave her credentials, and handed him a sealed envelope. He didn't take his eyes off her until she crossed the threshold. Lauren came down the stairs as we moved into the living room. Her steps faltered when she saw May sitting across from me. May opened her folder and began laying out documents. Draft conservation easement paperwork, letters to 2 state preservation agencies, and a notice about a possible review concerning elder intimidation. She asked if I had changed my mind about protecting the land in full. I told her I hadn't. It was never meant to be divided. Ryan started pacing near the window. He said I was being unreasonable, that the land was too valuable to let it sit untouched, and that I had no right to stand in the way of progress. I let him finish before reaching into the desk beside me. I took out a small voice recorder, pressed play, and set it on the coffee table. The audio filled the room, the tack room door closing, the sound of a belt cutting through the air. Their voices giving calm, deliberate instructions, and Lauren's warning at the end. It lasted less than 3 minutes, but the silence afterward felt longer. May closed the recorder and said she was now obligated to advise that I seek formal protection through legal channels. She asked if I wanted her to initiate the next step. I told her yes. Lauren stood and left the room without a word. Ryan stayed in place, fists clenched, staring at the rug. May gathered the documents into neat stacks, sliding them back into her satchel before standing. She promised to follow up by the end of the week. The rest of the day passed in slow, uneven hours. Ryan and Lauren moved through the house without speaking to me, collecting items from the guest rooms and stacking boxes near the stairs. By evening, the smell of their cologne and perfume hung in the air, like a final trace of them. I stood on the porch as they carried the last bag to the SUV. Ryan paused before getting in his jaw, set his eyes holding mine for only a moment before he closed the door. The sound of gravel under the tires lingered after the taillights disappeared. Inside, the rooms felt larger. I opened windows to let the night air move through and began putting things back in place. In the kitchen, I returned the flour to the bottom cabinet and tossed the protein powders Lauren had left behind. In the living room, I folded the throw blanket over the arm of Ethan's chair. The barn took longer. Ryan had left tools scattered and tire tracks marked the dirt near the south fence where boards had been pried loose. I hammered them back in before dusk, each nail set flush against the wood. 2 days later, a letter from the county office arrived in the mail. Inside was a preliminary review confirming my right to keep the property intact under a private conservation provision. The language was formal, but the line naming me primary steward settled something inside me. The ranch was recognized as whole, and my name was tied to it. Still, there was no feeling of victory, only a quiet steadiness. That weekend, I called Mrs. Delaney, the retired music teacher who ran a weekend program for local children. I told her the West Barn was open if she needed space. She came by with 2 volunteers that Saturday. We swept the floors, cleared cobwebs, and set up folding chairs. The work was simple, but it changed the air inside that building. By the time they left, the place no longer felt like it had during those tense weeks. It felt ready for something else. That night, I sat on the back steps watching the wind move through the pasture. The grass bent and straightened in slow waves, the sky fading to gold behind it. Somewhere beyond the ridge, I knew Ryan and Lauren were making their own lives, but they couldn't touch what remained here. The land was mine to care for, and the stillness was mine to keep. The letter from the county had barely settled in my desk drawer when an envelope arrived in the day's mail without a return address. The postmark was from Arizona. I stood by the mailbox for a moment before slipping it into my apron pocket and walking the fence line. I tightened wire where it sagged, refilled the chicken's water, and swept the porch before finally sitting at the kitchen table to open it. The letter was from Lauren. It was typed with margins, so even it looked more like a contract than a note. She wrote that she and Ryan were in Arizona now. He was managing a few rental properties part-time, and she was starting a consulting business. She said they were stable, that they regretted how things unfolded, and called it a period of high tension and miscommunication. The word sorry never appeared. She closed by saying they might like to visit at some point to talk. I folded the letter in half and slid it under the yellow notepad on the table. That evening, the air turned crisp, and I lit a fire in the hearth. Sitting in Ethan's chair with a quilt over my knees, I let the sound of the wood settling fill the room. I thought about how long it takes for people to recognize what they've broken, and how often by then, it's no longer theirs to mend. That weekend, the barn filled with the sound of children's voices. Mrs. Delaney brought a small group from her weekend program, and they ran through the hay rows with the kind of energy that rattles the rafters. Their mothers stayed on the porch, sipping coffee, talking in low tones, while the kids played. One woman, Tasha, brought me a jar of lemon preserves. She said she hadn't seen her son smile like that in weeks. I put it on the pantry shelf with the others, a row of small thank yous. That night, I walked to the edge of the south pasture. The stars were scattered thick across the sky, sharp against the black. I stood listening to the crickets and the wind brushing the fence. The quiet felt settled, not empty. Over the next weeks, the rhythm of the place changed. I rose before sunrise because I wanted to, not because I had to. I fed the hens, checked the rain barrels, and sat on the back porch with my coffee as the horizon turned gold. The paperwork for the easement came through 2 weeks later, stamped filed and official. The ranch could never be sold off in pieces. I called May to thank her. She said it had been an honor that women like me reminded her why she did the work. That evening, I walked the field lines with the last of the sunlight behind me, my boots pressing into the soft earth. I touched the posts Ethan and I had nailed in years ago, the wood worn smooth by weather. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for an apology, not for the past to lose its weight. The land felt lighter under my feet, as if it knew it was safe. I was ready for whatever came next. What came next was quiet work. I spent the following mornings walking the fence lines, checking the posts Ethan and I had set so many years ago. I oiled the hinges on the south gate and tightened the wire where it sagged. In the afternoons, I swept the west barn and set out the folding chairs until the space felt open and welcoming again. The children returned on Saturdays, their voices filling the rafters, and the porch became a place where their mothers could breathe. May called to say the county had processed the easement and entered it into the record. She didn't linger on details, just confirmed that the land was protected whole and permanent. I thanked her and wrote a note to Edna, slipping it into the mail with a pressed sprig of sage. Reverend Paul stopped by later that week to check on me. We sat on the porch and watched the hawks circle over the pasture, neither of us needing many words. A few days later, I opened the safe in Ethan's office and set things in order. The recorder went back beside the framed deed, and his ledger rested on top of both. I slid the manila envelope marked "In case" to the rear and turned the dial with a steady hand. There was nothing left to prove, but I kept the pieces together, the way Ethan liked it. When I closed the safe, the house felt settled. Ryan and Lauren did not write again. The letter from Arizona stayed under my notepad, folded once edges aligned. Some evenings I would pause by the table and rest my fingertips on it, then move on. It was not forgiveness, and it was not punishment. It was simply where the letter belonged now. The ranch did not change its rhythm for it. Spring found its way into every corner. New grass pushed up along the west fence, and the creek ran louder than it had in years. I started rising before sunrise because I wanted to see the pink light hit the east pasture. I made coffee and opened the back door, letting the morning air move through the kitchen. The house breathed with me instead of against me. One Saturday, the children brought handmade signs for the barn and taped them to the posts. The words were uneven and bright. We set a small table near the door with a tin of cookies and a pitcher of water. Their laughter traveled all the way to the porch swing. Standing at the threshold, I felt what I had been building toward, without naming it, not victory, not even relief, a steady sense that the place was finally being used the way it was meant to be. I have learned that justice does not always sound like a gavel. Sometimes it is a paper filed on the right day, a neighbor who shows up, and a door left open for children who need a safe room. Dignity can be quiet. It can be a woman who keeps the deed on the wall and her feet on the ground, who does not raise her voice, but does not move aside. On the last evening of spring, I sat in Ethan's chair with the window cracked and the porch light flickering the way it always has at dusk. The breeze carried the smell of cut hay and the faint echo of laughter from the barn. I thought about the years we spent here and the ones still ahead, and how a legacy can be as simple as leaving a place better than you found it. The land was whole. I was too. Thank you for sitting with me through this. If any part of my story met you where you are, share it with someone who could use a steady word. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stay.